Welcome to Healing the Tigress, a podcast of conversations and stories on Asian American Pacific Islander maternal mental health. We are your hosts. I'm Peggy, a perinatal mental health therapist.
And I'm Jasmine, a clinical pharmacist who is perinatal mental health certified. Both of us are Taiwanese American mothers who have lived experiences of postpartum depression and anxiety. It felt like we didn't see anyone who looked like us also struggling with their mental health in new motherhood. But we would go on to learn that it wasn't just us and that there was so much more to perinatal mental health.
So we created this podcast because we know that sharing these stories can begin to break the stigma of mental health in our community, and we want to help heal the inner tigress in all AAPI parents. Let's get started. Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Healing the Tigress. Today's guest has quite the resume, and we are really excited and honored to talk with her about her postpartum story. In particular, we are grateful that she has been such a great advocate on the topic of the highly stigmatized and misunderstood condition of postpartum psychosis, which can affect 1 to 2 in 1,000 women.
And I also wanted to give a little shout out to Tina Cartwright of Rebranding Motherhood for helping to connect us with our guest today, Kriti Lodha. Kriti is a South Asian mom and seasoned marketing and technology executive with a track record of building and scaling multi-million-dollar businesses, brands, and teams, including Toast and Procter Gamble. Today, Kriti proudly serves as an executive advisor at the Center for Women's Mental Health at Mass General Hospital, on the board of directors at Postpartum Support International, as well as a peer support group leader for fellow psychosis survivors. Oof, you do a lot, Kriti. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. Would you please kick us off by telling our listeners a little bit about your cultural background and then where you are in your motherhood journey?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, as a listener of this show, I'm so honored to be here. As a brand marketer, I love the name, Healing the Tigress. This conversation is about healing me and my inner tigress, so thank you for having me. As far as my background, I have an interesting background. So I have South Asian descent, so my family's originally from India, but I'm an immigrant. So I actually was born and raised in Luxembourg, which is a tiny little country in Europe. So I was born and raised there. My father's work took our family there and really grew up in Europe until I was 11 and then moved to the Bay Area. As many folks that are interested in tech do, my father moved into technology and really spent my adolescence in California, and then ultimately moved to the East Coast for school, and then had a brief stint in Cincinnati, Ohio before moving back to Boston. So while I am, of Indian and South Asian descent, I see myself as equal parts European, American, truly have had the immigrant experience. My partner is also an immigrant. And so that's been really interesting in our journey as well. And now raising our daughter. As far as my motherhood journey, we'll get into all of the specifics of how I became a mom, but I had my daughter, Nana, 4 years ago in the peak of the pandemic. And then I have my dog son, Simba, who's 6, who's an Australian Labradoodle. Yeah, happy to be here.
I love hearing about the Labradoodle. Actually, Simba was the name of my dog's parent. I don't know, this is kind of a random fact, but his parents were named Nala and Simba. So I'm like, oh, that's so cute.
Perfect.
Yeah. Well, you've been really open about sharing your story, and we know you've shared it before in other outlets. So thank you for diving deeper into it today with us. I'm going to set the stage a little bit for our listeners. It sounded like you had always wanted to be a mom. You even had a name prepared for your future child when you were 17. And despite, though, having PCOS and other conditions that made it challenging, you got pregnant. You had a beautiful baby girl. And although it happened during the peak of the pandemic, which meant it was a lot of isolation. So can you just walk us through maybe what happened after your daughter came, and when did postpartum psychosis started to become noticeable?
Yeah, that's a great question. I had, medically a high-risk pregnancy because of what you mentioned, because of PCOS. And I also had history of something called precocious puberty. And my mother had preeclampsia. So there were lots of things that, my OB and I and my partner were managing. And so I had a high risk throughout. And so there was obviously some anxiety around that. And then in the pandemic, it was very isolating. Only a handful of people saw me pregnant, including my own brother didn't, who lived in California and lives there. And the reason I bring that up is I think actually there was a multitude of things, even though clinically I didn't have any history of any mental illness or known family history. There were lots of little fires everywhere, so to speak, leading up to the delivery. And I think for me, I remember I was one of the first pregnant women that even got vaccinated by Johnson & Johnson, 38 weeks pregnant, and trying to figure out whether we do that and whether or not my partner would even be allowed with me in labor and delivery and what it would mean to labor in a mass. So I bring that up because I think really the symptoms, and I'll kind of work backwards, happened about 2 weeks postpartum. But there were lots of things that maybe weren't clinically things that would have come up in a conversation with an OB or even in a screener that kind of added up leading up to when I had my psychosis, which I'll talk about. So first, my birth was really traumatic. Now I know a traumatic birth is a thing. I didn't know that. It lasted over 46 hours. And so that, I think, there was a lot behind that just from the get-go, and lack of sleep just through, I would say probably 72 hours of not sleeping just from that process and leading up to it, and the anxiety around whether or not my water had broken. And then subsequently, I think the other piece of it was my daughter was having a hard time latching and feeding from the beginning. So even though my milk production was fine, it was getting really challenging. Feeding was very arduous. And so already I was not sleeping because of just the process of trying to get her to get the adequate supply. And then a couple weeks in, she had lost a third of her body weight in the checkup. And so we had to wean to formula. We were basically told right away. And that happened to coincide with the same day my partner went to work. And so that all happened. And again, no one really knows exactly what happened, but that, from what I remember at that point, I didn't sleep for 4 days straight, and ultimately believe I had the manic episode and psychotic episode. And really my path to care at a very high level in terms of symptoms was my OB and my partner admitting me to the ER, subsequent inpatient hospitalization, and then eventually a partial program out of state. So way more we can talk about there, but I would say really, again, 2 weeks in. But now that I think about it, a lot of things that probably led up to it that maybe on paper would not have put me as someone who's at risk for postpartum psychosis, or frankly, even any other PMAD, because it just wasn't in my history and it didn't come up explicitly in pregnancy in any way that I needed any clinical intervention for.
I hear a lot of the sort of common themes from stories of postpartum psychosis survivors, like the lack of sleep for several days that just really impairs or just kind of triggers something that damages the brain maybe, or somehow. The lack of sleep, the traumatic birth. We've heard this before too, how that might have been something that kind of kicked off things too. Stopping breastfeeding like immediately, that drop in hormones, that shift too is huge. So I'm picking up on some of these common things, and I'm so glad that you got help soon, that your partner was and your OB and people were on board to get you that help that you needed.
Yeah, I know that those are listed as risk factors for PMHDs in our PMHC training, and yet they are also very common things that new moms are experiencing. Birth can be very traumatic. Breastfeeding can be really hard. Sleep is really hard. But I feel like there's also an extreme of it, of extreme sleep deprivation, extreme impact of the traumatic birth. And at what point do you say, okay, these are the red flags that I need to get help?
Can I add actually 2 quick thoughts on that point, Peggy? I think something interesting that you made me think of, one which I've talked about publicly, and the other I haven't actually yet. One is, I do consider myself someone who informs himself. And so I did educate myself on the kind of quintessential idea of postpartum depression, but I had mania and highs, and I had a lot of confidence as a mom. And to be honest, throughout my journey with postpartum psychosis, including my recovery, my daughter was actually the person that gave me a lot of comfort. So I feel like I also had this paradigm in my head of sort of what are the signs to look for that, of course, are signs of depressive symptoms, but it just was like not nuanced enough. And so in my head, even when things fell off, it just wasn't something that fit my paradigm. Like, I love being around my daughter and I felt great. I got out of bed and I took long showers and, things like that. So I think that's the one thing. And then the other thing I would add, which is interesting, and I've never talked about this publicly, so this is new, but on Instagram, I was Instagram active at that time. I had actually posted something, a long post, about a week before I was hospitalized. Who knows if I was already emerging into mania, where I literally talked about, I have medically the baby blues. And I had a list of all the things that I needed to do. Like, I need to find a therapist. I need to set boundaries. I need, all these things. And now, like, I just reread that, a few days ago in light of something I was doing. And I was like, oh, like a week before it went wrong, something was there. But even in my head, I was like, I was latching on to something. I was like, I have the baby blues. So like, let me do all these things. And the reality is with something like postpartum psychosis, something I often tell in even groups, this is a break from reality. So there's no like intent. There's no control over what happens. It's truly a disassociation. And so I think, it's interesting that even in those moments, I had some paradigm of like baby blues or postpartum depression, but like when things didn't fit that picture, it was confusing for me and confusing for the people taking care of me and my baby as well.
That actually perfect segue to my next question, because there was these behaviors leading up to the psychotic episode that, like you said, kind of blurs these lines of I'm grasping to reality, I'm not. Some of the things you mentioned, first there was the abrupt weaning from the breastfeeding, the not sleeping, and then the ruminative behavior, the writing profusely. This Instagram post where were you writing it for yourself or to others or to justify or to try to make sense of what you're experiencing, what felt like a manic episode? And even trying to self-diagnose and you have mentioned justifying to family members and emails too, not just in this Instagram post, what was happening. And you're kind of starting to explain it now, but in hindsight, when you look back, what was most telling to you about these behaviors? Because I know one thing as people are hearing your story is like, well, what are the warning signs? How would I know? Because back then I know this stuff. I'm trying to balance these. Now, when you look back on it, what was most telling about those behaviors for you?
Yeah, that's a good point. I guess I'll start like micro in terms of postpartum psychosis and then zooming out now with the vantage point I have, some of the things around just perinatal mental health in general. On postpartum psychosis, I think it's what Jasmine said earlier. People underestimate the importance of sleep. Fellow survivors, we talk about it all the time. It's as much circumstances as it is biology. Like I think folks have this image of who this happens to. And what I often say is obviously there are risk factors. And even like, for example, there are folks who have bipolar disorder that might be at higher risk, but not everyone who has postpartum psychosis has bipolar disorder or has the kind of classic indicators. And so this really can happen to anyone in all the right circumstances. I mean, in an unfortunate way. So I do think sleep is like super important. I think now doing the work I know now, just the impact of just feeding and the kind of, actually Dr. Bruna Nonax, who's one of my colleagues, just did a great blog post on the bidirectional relationship of breastfeeding and perinatal mental health. So I just think that like there's so much nuance to that. I had no idea. And to be very honest, like probably my pediatrician didn't either when she made the best recommendations for her patient, who is my baby. And so I think that's the second. And then I think zooming out, this is probably a big part of why the show exists. I didn't know that just by being born brown, that I would be at higher risk. Because like, I think this illness doesn't discriminate by socioeconomic status or where you live. It really is disproportionately going to impact communities of color. Not only will it disproportionately impact those communities, they're also much less likely to receive help. And I come from a place from privilege. So I actually could get access to treatment. So I think for me, even just recognizing that there was a lot of sort of latent risk factors in general across the spectrum of perinatal mental health that I wish I'd known. And then the last thing I'll add in terms of hindsight, and I didn't know this until I started facilitating support groups, which is people focus a lot, and all people, I mean, even clinicians or even the narrative on like the kind of acute postpartum psychosis diagnosis and crisis. But because it's a medical emergency and many of folks do need wraparound, not everyone, but hospitalization or medication management, et cetera, people don't realize that oftentimes coming out of that, a lot of survivors will forget even anything else clinical, just from the mental health standpoint, experience PTSD or even postpartum depression. And I had both. So I think for me, like, I actually didn't even know I had postpartum depression, but now looking back, I'm like, oh, it wasn't just the medications. So I do think that also like, there's like a lot of just sort of solving for this acute illness and crisis, but there's a lot that comes with postpartum psychosis, be it trauma, PTSD, be it depression, but also just the level of isolation on top of what anyone would feel facing. It's just an added layer of isolation because of all the narrative and sensationalized, and as I often say, either misinformation or lack of information around it. And I don't know which is worse sometimes, to be honest. They're both equally bad.
I like how you have described in other interviews before about how when you were kind of in the height of that frenzy of writing. And it was like your cry for help almost, because you were like doing the self-diagnosing and you were saying like, I think I have this, but like, what can I need to do XYZ steps. And even amidst all that, you were still thinking about your daughter first and foremost. Like, how do I take care of her by taking care of me almost? And like kind of that, like you like to say, like tragic and beautiful kind of way. And so I've always found that very like touching, and to also show that the media sensationalizes psychosis as these horrific things that happened, but mothers are just trying to do the best that they can for their babies. They really are. And I think like, your blur between reality and not still almost felt like the reality was you were really, really just trying to take care of yourself and your baby. So I just wanted to highlight that part of your story that was really touching to me. And then I also want to focus a little bit, like shift to the feeding journey, because I know you've also been very vocal about, how much shame and stigma there can be around not breastfeeding, especially in our communities. And so for you personally, like, did you feel like there was pressure to breastfeed? And like, where was that specifically coming from? Like, was it family? Was it societal? Was it cultural? What is the dialogue around that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a newer subject for me to talk about. And I really wish I could talk about it more, because I think it's something I've been processing more in the last year, probably actually. The way I would kind of initially answer that question, and then I'll elaborate, is internal and cultural. And that's what I would say. So I'll start with the internal. I'm a planner. I'm a type A person. Maybe that's what got me into this mess. Who knows? And my husband and I, like, just to be very frank, like, we wanted to breastfeed. No one was telling us we had to. Like, I genuinely wanted to. Both of us love to cook and cooking. And so like in my head, like, yeah, like I'm going to try to nourish my daughter with like the best I can. And then I think honestly, I felt so much gratitude around the fact that I got pregnant. Like I grew up my entire life just assuming I'd be infertile. And then when my milk started coming in, it was just brought me so much joy of like, wow, like my body is superhuman. Like I shouldn't be able to do these things and I can. And so I just felt this responsibility of like, I'm going to give her this. And I think for me, like, what I will say though, is like, when we saw what happened with her birth weight, it wasn't even a question for my partner and I, like, that this was like what we needed to do in a moment of crisis. And then frankly, we didn't have a choice to switch to formula entirely, because once I was hospitalized, unfortunately, because I didn't have specialized perinatal care and the medications I was on, keeping me safe and alive trumped breast milk, and keeping her nourished trumped breast milk. So I think the reality is I think internally, I just felt like, and this happens oftentimes with folks who have postpartum psychosis, it's not just like the grief and loss of I was away from my baby or that time I lost, or it's like literally I just didn't do the job. Like I remember I didn't even change a diaper for 40 days probably is my guess, because I just couldn't for a variety of reasons. So I think like there was an internal pressure of like, oh, like what didn't I do? Why couldn't I have done this? And I'll be honest, like it still happens where I'll talk to other Asian, in particular Asian moms, South Asian moms, and I still get the kind of like, oh, sorry, you have to do formula. And now I'm proud to be like, you know what? Like, fed is best. I'm not denigrating or even endorsing any choice. But at the end of the day, for me, every mom wants or birthing person wants what's best for their child. And to your point, it's like what did they say on the plane? The oxygen mask. Like, I just like, I had to be a present mom for her. And that's what I had to do. So I think there was internal. On the cultural standpoint, which probably fed into the internal, I would say part of the kind of irony is that in South Asian culture, there's a deep tradition of taking care of mom, and actually milk production and preparing your body for milk production is a thing. So not only does mom stay with you for 40 days, which my mom did, which she would have done independent of the crisis. Literally there's like herbs and spices you take, and there's like all this stuff. And, Indian families tend to be open. There was like a bunch of people talking about it. So I would say a lot of the shame came from like, oh shoot, like, we can't bring up the fact that you now have a bottle, because then people will be like, well, why do you have a bottle? And then at that point, which I'm sure we'll get to, for 3 years, my extended family didn't know about my illness. So I just think that like, there was a lot of just sort of like cultural traditions of like, oh, like we actually do take care of mom and we do nourish her. And so I think there was some confusion there too of, am I failing them as well? Not because like my mom or my husband were saying anything. Actually, if anything, my husband says, he thinks it was the best choice we made in crisis because it empowered him. It empowered him to step up and be there for my daughter and nourish her. And so I think the reframe of like, this is a way for him to help nourish her, I think is interesting. and different than the generations above us, I think, in terms of how we parent our children.
Yeah. That makes me think of Anhoni Patel's episode from season 2 when, she was saying when it comes to that courageous choice of saying like, look, I have to take care of the captain of the ship. I'm butchering her quote now, but it made me think of that because what she does for a living is using a lot of the South Asian, Indian cultural practices of those herbs and spices to nourish mom's body so that she can breastfeed. But ultimately, I loved how she said like, but at the end of the day, are my kids great because I breastfed them? No, it's because I parented. And like, you have to take care of the captain of the ship. And that might mean I'm not going to breastfeed. I need to take care of my mental health. And I love that you said it also gives your partner a chance to nourish the child.
And I think it's good to keep reminding ourselves that your mental health is worth taking care of and that it can trump the feeding as much as you want to do it. Because I know I had put a lot of pressure on myself to continue to breastfeed, and I had a very short journey as well. In the beginning, I kind of beat myself up for it because, I said, I thought stopping breastfeeding would resolve my depression, and it didn't. And so I felt even more guilt. But in the long run, looking back, like, it was the best choice that we had made for our family too. And I needed the sleep as well. So thank you for being brave to talk about it, because I do think people need to hear it, especially from people that look like you, talking about that this was their experience and that it's okay. And like, look, our kids are older now and they're fine. It's not the breast milk that turns them into good people. It's our parenting, really. So yeah.
I love that. And I think the other thing is like, now that my daughter's 4.5, zooming out, like obviously as an infant, I want to give her the best nutrition, but by month 4, we were moving on to solids as well. And now like we cook all the time. We cook together. Her favorite food is mapo tofu, believe it or not.
Oh my gosh.
And dumpling. She had that last night, but
Speaks to my heart.
Cook Asian food. She knows how to make like air fried vegetables and Greek salad and caprese salad. And like we've been starting to teach her Indian food because we're all really into cooking. So my point is like that nourishment now, looking back, I'm like, there's so many chapters. And I think sometimes as we get so fixated on the infant chapters, that was just the last thing I would add on that topic. But either way, fed is best, do what feels right for you, and know that it might change despite what you plan and what you intend. And that it's okay to feel grief and loss around those choices too, whatever that looks like for you.
Yes.
I'm going to pivot us a bit back onto your psychosis journey. And we know that eventually you were able to get help and get treatment. And as people are learning more about it, they might have a lot of questions and fears around it. Can you share with us how long your treatment was for? And was there any stigma around having to take medication or going to therapy?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I was thinking about this. I was like, there's the medical treatment and recovery, and then there's the healing my inner tigress journey, which are two different journeys. So I think in terms of like medically speaking, and this is, I think, pretty typical depending on when your psychosis happens. But for me, it was about a year of kind of full recovery. And we'll talk about, and when I say recovery, I mean when I was being treated in terms of medication management, and when I was seeing a psychiatric prescriber where I was like checking in ongoing. Now I will acknowledge, right? I fall into the camps of folks where I didn't have a chronic illness or I don't have a co-occurring, mood disorder. So like that, there might be ongoing medication management or supports that need to be in place for other people. But in general, recovering from this particular episode and this particular postpartum psychosis experience for me was about a year. And it did look like a combination of med management, therapy with a perinatal therapist. I wish it had been PSI. It wasn't on my radar, which we'll get into, I'm sure, at all. And then frankly, amazing community support. My mom was my night nurse for 4 months. My in-laws were with us for many months after. I mean, I'm so lucky. There were so many people, helping us. And I, physically I was away from my family for, 2 to 4 weeks in sort of just hospital programs and partial programs, but mentally I was removed for a while. In terms of your question of like, was there stigma? Interestingly, like, I think that there was such crisis management that, I mean, not to sound dark, but like the medication kept me alive. So I don't even think that there was like a thought around that aspect of it. Therapy is something I had wanted forever. I wish that long before even getting pregnant, I think the crisis just sort of like lit the fire of like, oh no, like this has to happen. So I actually don't think there was necessarily like a stigma around that. I do think though, the stigma of the hospitalization, that I am a high achieving South Asian woman that went to a psychiatric unit, that actually, as I say sometimes, I lost my mind. I was not fit to parent. Those are true statements. There's no value judgment. Those are just objectively true. And then of course, going to a partial, I think that was really the stigma. And so when I talk about healing my inner tigress, technically, like actually for me, like the compliance to the like recommendations, because I had exceptional providers, again, I had a lot of luck there, was not an issue for me or my partner. I mean, did I have days where I hated the medications because of the symptoms? Absolutely. Or even the weight gain. Like I could like zoom out and be like, okay. But beyond 5 or 6 people, did anyone know what I went through? Grandparents, aunts, uncles. There were some friends that knew about it. Coworkers, when I went back to work 4 months postpartum at a really intense job. No, I didn't talk about it for 3 years. So even though I continued therapy after a year, between year and 1 and 3, it took 3 years before folks knew about what happened. So there's clearly, I'm sure, I'm not a therapist, but I'm sure my therapist would have lots to tell you if she were to come on the podcast about what's behind that. And really working through, as I mentioned earlier, my PTSD in particular. But I would say the postpartum depression / psychosis symptoms, a year. The PTSD and the shame, I guess a few years, you could say. But I would argue I'm still in recovery. I'm still healing from that journey. And for me, doing this work and having this conversation with both of you, in all honesty, like this is part of the healing.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I think, medications are life-saving, can be life-saving. And it's good to hear that they worked for you. Like, look, it's not something to be ashamed of to take if it's going to save your life, if it's going to make you be around for your daughter. Like, yes, by all means. And even the hospitalization and the work that you did through there, therapy and everything. And I feel like all of us are still healing, like just continually. So
hence the title of the podcast.
Yeah. And one thing though that I have learned from about postpartum psychosis, from listening to other survivor stories, is that some people say it can be really dangerous to label postpartum psychosis as, quote, rare. And because it makes people kind of brush it off as something that they don't really need to look out for, or they don't need to be concerned about because it's rare. It's not going to happen to me. But if it does happen, it truly is a medical emergency, like we talked about. So what can you add to this dialogue about the rarity of this happening, having yourself been a survivor of postpartum psychosis?
I love that you're asking that question. I'm actually going to initially quote my colleague, Dr. Lee Cohen, who will often say to me, he said it to me in one of our first conversations, it isn't rare when it's your sister or your daughter or your niece or your colleague or your friend. The reality is, like, before I even get into some of my philosophical thoughts, what a lot of people may not know is that postpartum psychosis is not in the DSM. It is not an official diagnosis. In fact, I don't think I've even mentioned this publicly. I wasn't actually diagnosed with postpartum psychosis until I was outpatient with a psychiatrist. So that was probably like 6 to 8 weeks after birth that I even like knew this was what I was going through. At that point, it was like manic episode, maybe it's a mood disorder. So like, I actually think this is opinion. I'm not a medical professional, but my marketing brain says that if you don't even have it as a diagnosis, I think, and I've heard this anecdotally from providers that I work with that support this population, we're probably missing it more than we think. And it's probably understated. I think also part of the reason people have this perception of rare is all the storytelling is around the tragedies. What people may not realize is that it's a fraction of folks that have within postpartum psychosis. So you have the folks that actually have thoughts of harm or self-harm, whether of harm to others, and command actions. There's no reason to vilify them. It's truly a break from reality. That's the minority, but those are the stories that get magnified, the tragedies. And so when those get magnified, this perception is like, oh, well, like this is like a once in the blue moon person, who went crazy, which I hate using those words. Whereas when you actually focus on the bevy of survivors that exist, there's so many of us have gone through this because of what we talked about, like with the wrong circumstances and with a certain set of factors, biology, genetics, whatever, this can happen to anyone. And at the end of the day, maternal mental health is the leading complication of pregnancy and childbirth. And the leading cause of maternal mortality is maternal suicide. And so there's no higher risk population than folks that have experienced what I've experienced, regardless of what outcome they have. And so for me, I feel like we owe it to those, terrible news headlines. For me, like I often think about lives lost. And this is why we do the work, because it's unacceptable to have even one of those stories ever come out when this is treatable. Like this is not something where we don't know the cure. If you all saw me 3 years ago versus now, oh my gosh, it's remarkable. And so the last thing I'll say on that is like working at Mass General, we have the Postpartum Psychosis Project, and we're actually doing, I believe, again, don't cite me on this, but from what I know, the largest study of research on postpartum psychosis survivors globally. I was talking to the team, I think about this last week. I think we have over 400 folks that have taken the courage, and I've done those clinical interviews, 4 hours of bearing your soul, your deepest, darkest secrets, your experiences. And so there are people that are, unfortunately, it's just like any kind of advocacy, like it shouldn't be on survivors like me to kind of say what you're saying. So thank you for asking that question and making that statement, because we need everyone to see it that way. And there are 400 and something people around the world that are bearing their soul to make sure that we don't let this happen to anyone else. So I do agree that narrative is super harmful, because then it's really easy to brush it under the rug and not take accountability. And taking accountability is because it is treatable. Timely treatment will make the difference between me and a news headline that you saw. So there is no need to celebrate me. There is privilege and luck. That's the only difference between me and someone else who unfortunately had a more dire outcome.
I love what you said about how it's falling on the shoulders of survivors, because throughout your whole story, I think to myself as a provider, like had I been your not to toot my horn, but had I been your therapist and I was hearing that you were writing profusely, like after so much and all these little signs, had a provider been able to notice these types of signs for so many of the survivors too, being able to have early detection and prevention and get people treatment sooner. And it sounds like you did get treatment in, I'm hoping, a timely manner, but it is just wild to me. Like you said, this isn't a DSM diagnosis. I have to provide a diagnosis for insurance reasons constantly. And I primarily work with perinatal population. And I kid you not, most of them don't quote unquote meet criteria for postpartum depression, even though they are definitely experiencing perinatal mental health disorders, because someone wrote it in a book that these are the things. And when you look at what diagnoses, quote unquote, you can provide, that's the only one. That is the only one that has an ICD-10 code is postpartum depression. When we've seen through all of this now that there is such a wide range of mental health disorders and experiences that are happening perinatally. And it also goes to show how little people are paying attention to or creating space to look at how we can be preventive and treat everything.
I love that you said that. And like the reality is like, if we don't value those lives will be lost and it will be a shame. And as a business person, it also costs our healthcare system. So maternal mental health conditions, and I'm quoting MMHLA. So shout out to MMHLA for their fact sheets. $14 billion goes from just maternal mortality or morbidity from all conditions, and not specifically postpartum psychosis, of course, but from any kind of severe outcome. So like, this is expensive, y'all. So even from like in the current, environment, everything like, this is just preventable healthcare cost, even to look at it. I know that sounds a little bit less human, but it's just the truth. Like it's also very costly to our health system as well.
And I mean, I know you said it sounds very not human, but we have to look at who is going to have the power and the money to make the changes. They're going to want to see numbers. They're going to want to see outcomes. And while the heartbreaking stories may not equal numbers to some people, like what you said is true. Like how is this a bigger systemic thing that we need to be addressing? On that, there's a lot of misinformation about postpartum psychosis. What are some things that you wish others knew, and how do we talk about it and talk about warning signs without creating more anxiety or causing people to be overly paranoid?
Yeah, I think maybe I'll start with the latter and then I'll go into the former. So I think I actually talked to Tina about this when she and I spoke about this topic. So I think first and foremost, and this is besides marketing, I actually have a customer experience background. So I think in like journeys. So the first thing is that you remove a lot of the fear, anxiety, and doubt if you start early and often, and everyone gets that message. And that's just like the thing that I say about hope. Fear obviously is a lot more easily marketable, but like fear and shame and crisis, the way you solve for that is you kind of tell everyone. So to me, there's no difference, or there should be no difference, I should say, between someone warning me about postpartum hemorrhage or preeclampsia. I mean, we make a birth plan. So something I say all the time is like, just make the mental health plan. And again, using my example, maybe instead of worrying about exactly, well, Kriti, does she fit the profile? And again, I didn't have a therapist to support me with some of the signs that you were talking about. So even if I don't have a therapist or I don't have it, how do we make sure when I take the 20-week anatomy scan or whatever it is, whatever those kind of big milestones are, let me know. Something I actually have shared in the past, not on a podcast, but in other contexts, which is interesting, is when my discharge packet, we had 20 pieces of paper that had like all the warning signs of everything, like that you can imagine post-labor and delivery, feeding, whatever. I went back about a year ago and I opened it up and I showed my husband, there was a one-sheeter front and back on PMHDs. And I'm pretty sure it was from like the PSI website because they had like the blurbs. And PSI was one of the resources on there. And I showed my husband and I was like, oh, we had it literally in the binder. And he's like, oh, wow, how did I miss that? But it's like, at that point, we were dealing with like pandemic. So to me, it's like, if you tell and communicate all of the things, not just put to your point, not just for the ICT, I can't say that, the TOAD codes, beyond postpartum depression, educate everyone and help them understand. Because then you could actually say, if you're in a position where you have to be taken in a more intensive treatment, who's going to be plan B for baby? It's no different than like what happens if we have to do an emergency C-section. So that's sort of like the macro of like, you solve for a lot of things if you educate everyone, and you solve for kind of OB pain points of like, we don't have time. If you just say, hey, this is just the script. You're doing Lamaze classes, you're doing birth planning, let's just pull it in. The other thing I would say on specifically postpartum psychosis is, so, it can happen anywhere from 2 weeks to a year into postpartum, but even in pregnancy and even post-loss. So I think that's one thing people don't realize. So people can experience it post-loss and in pregnancy. That's one thing I'll point out. Sleep, we talked about. Inability to sleep is a really big deal. Majority of folks will not have thoughts of harm or self-harm. So that shouldn't be the only thing you're looking for. And not everyone experiences mania. So there might be folks who experience postpartum psychosis with more depressive symptoms, but don't actually show manic symptoms, which they might get misdiagnosed, right, with depression or something like that. So I think those are like the big things. And I think the last thing I'll say is like, I think there's a lot of conflation between intrusive thoughts and postpartum psychosis thoughts. The difference between, I might have the same thought than someone who maybe has OCD. And again, not a clinician, just saying from my experience. But the difference is that I'm not actually like aware that I'm having that thought and that is an intrusive thought, right? So like for folks that have hallucinations or delusions with postpartum psychosis, they truly do not know what's real and what's not. It is not the same thing as, oh, like I'm having these thoughts about my baby and why am I having these thoughts? Like the lack of awareness is just not there. So hopefully that's helpful, but I would say those are just a few of the things that I would emphasize, both macro and then going to the specific warning signs. But again, everyone's experience is different. So I'm sure there are differences for different folks.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I think the sleep one is really huge. I know that in my work, when I hear that any of my clients are having a severe lack of sleep to the point where they're experiencing things that are out of the ordinary or feeling like reality is a bit warped, that's my big red flag. Like even if they're not having hallucinations or delusions or thoughts of self-harm, like you said, it can start so small. And then immediately I'm like, let's drop everything. Let's come up with a sleep plan. I don't care about all these other things. Let's get you to sleep. And that I learned from Jasmine's personal story. I'm just like, let's get you to sleep is when at the moment I have anyone tell me that, I'm like, your brain is needing that sleep. How do we get you to sleep? And so I really try to press for like CBTI and other resources, referrals to psychiatrists for medication and stuff. But I love that you're saying it's not always that sensationalization of these grandiose thoughts all the time or thoughts of harm. It can start like ruminative writing, endless writing to justify your self-diagnosis, right? That's how it can start.
Yeah. And the last thing I'll add, I forgot, is it waxes and wanes. So like, that's why it's so hard to like keep track. So like I said, I don't know if when I wrote that Instagram post, maybe I was already manic. I don't know. Like I'm just saying 4 days of not sleeping is like when probably like my family noticed, but you don't know. So it waxes and wanes. So to your point, better safe than sorry. And the one plug I will give is PSI just created a discussion tool specifically for postpartum psychosis. I can make sure you all have in the show notes where you can literally actually see, even if you suspect it, it's literally a checklist that was made. I actually didn't create it, but a bunch of the survivors and clinicians who support these patients created a checklist of like things to look for that might be yellow flags or even red flags. to navigate that exact situation, Peggy, that you just spoke of, where it's just unclear and, it's just such an unknown sometimes.
Oh, I love that. Thank you. We are definitely going to link that. And I guess one thing I'll remind our listeners that we've also talked about before in the past is that it's not just on the mom. It really also depends on the people around you, which is why when you're coming up with this plan, it's not just for the mom to know what to do. Your partner, the people around you, your family members, like they have to be on alert to look out and see, that's a little odd. That's a little off. Or poke a little bit more, ask a little deeper. You know your person, like, and like, in a way that your husband's going to know something about that doesn't seem like you, or like it's a little bit like not a typical answer you would give. And then that's, when the discussion starts more. So your community and people around you are going to be very essential in helping you through any sort of perinatal mental health disorders, but even specifically more the psychosis if you want to catch that, because it waxes and wanes and they're going to have that spidey sense of like, that doesn't seem quite the same. So yeah. And I mean, we talked about that with our other South Asian guest, Jigna Patel, which maybe you know her from the support groups. Yeah. And last season when we were talking to her, she mentioned that it took her a long time to even admit to her family and friends. And then you sort of alluded to this too, that it took a long time to even like people to even know that this had happened to you. And, largely she said this was because of that strong South Asian stigma that was placed on mental health illness. So I'm curious for you, did you also feel this same sort of pressure, and what made you decide now to openly share your story amidst all these stigmas?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. And, I relate to Jigna so much. I didn't share my story for 3 years, and I'll share in what context I did and why. It comes back to internal and also sort of cultural. And now I mean culturally, broadening it to workplaces and not just like South Asian cultures. Internally, my brain failed me. My body failed me. I failed as a mom. And unfortunately, my way of coping with PTSD, with self-loathing, whatever it might have been, was proving to myself that I wasn't that person and that I could be, and I was exactly the person I was before this happened. So much so that, like I mentioned, I went back to work 4 months postpartum. I worked at a company where within the first week, I doubled my team at a tech company, which was a very high growth company. And within 6 months postpartum, I helped my company IPO. And it was a unicorn IPO. And I went on to be quite successful. And I think there was just a lot of fear around what people would say around this particular illness. And even frankly, would it affect my job? In my case, I'm privileged enough to not worry about someone taking my child away from me, which is another concern. But yeah, will it impact my job? I mean, I remember even my therapist, when I do this work, she's like, does it bother you that when people Google you, they're going to basically see you're a postpartum psychosis advocate? And in fact, many times people meet me, they're like, oh, you have a really interesting professional background, but it's just that's eclipsed. But I think there was a lot internally of just sort of, I can't be that person. And frankly, it helped me to hermit. So keeping my village small for me was what I needed in that time. But I often say to folks, disclosure versus not disclosing, who you disclose to, how wide you disclose is different by person and different by time. It's strange about me because I'm an open book. And so for me, my therapist, shout out Erin. I shout out Erin on every podcast I go on. I still see her to this day. She's incredible. She and I slowly started realizing that, I guess, as clinicians would say, maybe I was entering, she didn't say this, but I'm saying my post-traumatic growth journey. And really, I would say towards the end of 2023, I just really wanted to get into advocacy. That anger was still there, but now that anger was really pain that I needed to find a space for. How do I turn that into purpose? How do I turn that into something? And so it sounds kind of weird, but actually getting involved with PSI, which I'm sure we'll talk about. When I got involved with PSI, when I just decided to post my story on LinkedIn before telling anyone. So that was the first time my extended family, my coworkers, literally just, I wrote a post that was basically how I felt, and that was it. So until I had a space of I'm getting involved with PSI on the state chapter board at the time, it was the moment. And then it just was all out there. So maybe that's me. I went from nothing to just one day. I was ready. And yeah, now, I can't shut up about it. So that's where I'm at.
Well, let's go there. Let's talk about your work with PSI. And And one of the things we've noticed, Jasmine and I and others have gone through perinatal mental health disorder, we all end up coming to PSI, Postpartum Support International, through one way or the other, whether it's to get a PMHC, to be added to their directory, to become a peer mentor, whatever fashion and form. How did you become involved with PSI as a board director and support group leader? And what resources have you helped champion?
Yeah, that's a great question. So again, it started off as like I joined the state chapter board. I remember my board interview was like in Massachusetts, was like the first time I spoke to anyone outside of my therapist about it. And then I was like, oh, y'all were really supportive. Maybe I should just tell the world. So shout out to PSI Massachusetts, but joined that board beginning, I guess, of 2024. And I forgot to mention at that point, I took a sabbatical where I decided to sort of just lean into advocacy. And at that point, I didn't really know if it was passion or paycheck. And so I just like fell in love with PSI. And so like, I kind of joke with Wendy now that I just like volunteered everywhere. Like 2024, I was like, let me try this. So I like did a climb fundraiser in Massachusetts for Team Boston. A few months in, I sort of was like, I want to run support groups and help postpartum psychosis survivors. And so I started running that and then joined the postpartum psychosis task force. And then ultimately, like I did so much with PSI in 2024. And I found myself just like wanting to be the deputy and just tell anyone and everyone about PSI everywhere I went. That towards the end of 2024, I got connected with Karen, who's one of our board members who has also experience as a family member touched by postpartum psychosis. And I, being me, was like, I don't just want to do this in the state. I want to help PSI nationally, globally. To me, there's no reason that everyone shouldn't have a PMHC, that every parent and family should know about PSI. And so then I sort of just, decided to join the board of directors, and I've been on that since January. So it really just was love and belief in their mission and wanting to advance it. And in terms of the stuff I'm most proud of, to be honest, what I'm most proud of is like, I've underestimated the impact I can have as a volunteer of PSI, or even Peggy, you might have as a PMHC, like to just spread the mission and save lives. So I think that's it. But I would say specifically on the postpartum psychosis task force front, Julia, who's our program manager, is, oh my gosh, amazing. The amount of work we've done as a task force, I'm not taking personal credit, but of building a discussion tool. A bunch of us got together and redesigned a Get Help page where it's basically designed for any provider and patient on everything you need to know about postpartum psychosis. And then we did a campaign that a bunch of task force members started, just like PPP looks like me. So actually changing the narrative and showing the faces of postpartum psychosis in different cultures and languages. So I would say, of course, close to my heart is a lot of the work that really shepherded by Julia, the postpartum psychosis task force, has done to really change the tides. But I would say just frankly, being able to say I'm affiliated with PSI and help others in the way that I haven't, whether it's in a support group with a mom who's calling and asking me about things, or whether it's representing the board in a conference, whatever it is, I just feel so much joy in what I'm able to do with that organization.
I love hearing that passion. I feel like everyone I talk to that volunteers at PSI or has done something with them just emits that sort of same joy and like purpose that they really want to help other moms. So I feel like that's why I was so drawn to you too. Like this girl's passion is just, I want to like get near it. And so, I mean, you've done more than just PSI work. So, I mean, can you maybe share how you became involved with women's mental health at Mass General and maybe what kind of work they're doing there? And I don't know if you're allowed to tell us maybe what you're currently working on or hoping to do next.
Yes, I will do both. And this is where I'm not a very religious person at all, but my mom is always like, this is your fate. This is your karma. I did not go out of my way to be like, I want to work at the Mass General Center for Women's Mental Health. To be honest, because I have a tech background, I was like, when I decided, okay, this is what I actually want to go do, I want to tackle the crisis beyond just volunteering with PSI, I thought I'd go to a startup, right? There's some amazing startups that are doing amazing work in this space. But a bit of an aside, but I went back to a program at MIT where I sort of was like doing some soul searching of like, what do I want to do? And one of my professors is like, okay, you want to tackle the maternal mental health crisis. Great. What problem do you want to solve? For whom? And with whom? And I was like, oh, she's like, take the summer, go figure that out. And I realized for me, it was really, and this will touch on both the Mass General, but also what I'm doing next. It was really around access to treatment. To me, there's amazing resources like, the maternal mental health hotline and things like that. But to me, it's like, there's so much room to really improve. Once someone is experiencing a severe perinatal mental health challenge, they know about the resources, education. How do we improve that? And so somewhat serendipitously, the first advocacy interview I ever did with Jessie from Mass PVD Fund, which is a local nonprofit. She asked me if I could share my story, and I was terrified. For Maternal Mental Health Awareness Month last May, Dr. Lee Cohen read it and set up time with me. He wanted to chat. And I thought he just wanted to chat to I think we thought we would just chat about my experience and maybe I would get involved in the project, involved in the study. And it turned out that his mission of wanting to advance provider education and make sure that every provider was equipped to treat perinatal mental health, but also mental health across the reproductive lifespan. And also, really, he wanted to do more of the storytelling. How do we bring more of the patient stories and really bring the science and stories together? And so in chatting with him and Dr. Marlene Freeman, it was a no-brainer that if I could spend any of my time and energy supporting them, I would. And so just to kind of summarize where I'm at now with them, there's a few programs I'm working on with them, and then I'll briefly touch on what's next as well. One is I'm really proud. We launched a podcast called So Glad You Asked with Dr. Ruta Nodex. So helping conceptualize and really get that to market. It was really about how do we put the patient in the driver's seat. And in a time where access and equity is so challenging, no matter where you live, whether you're in what state or where you deliver, how do we make sure that everyone's empowered to ask real questions and access world-class experts? I think that's something that's been really humbling to be a part of. The other is that, Dr. Cohen conceptualized and produced a documentary called More Than Blue, which actually features stories of postpartum depression, anxiety, but also postpartum psychosis. I'm not in it, but he made it before my time, but across America. And it also has the evidence base and experts. So actually helping him think through how do we get screenings around not just this country, but the world, because even that storytelling can save lives. And I think both he and I share this belief that hope and storytelling around that is what's going to save lives, not fear and shame. So I think, and then we're doing some work on just provider education and how do we get more specific offerings beyond our current virtual rounds program for prescribers like psychiatrists or nurse practitioners to make sure they're equipped to support this patient population. So a lot there. So let me briefly touch on where I'm at in the future and where I'm headed, marrying both my MGH experience and my PSI experience is really reimagining systems of care that I didn't have. And so I'm working on building my own business that really looks at how do we expand access to treatment for families touched by severe perinatal mental illness through intensive treatment programs in Massachusetts. So that's something I'm in the early stages of developing, and I'm sure I'll have more to share, hopefully over the coming months and years on that.
Oh, it makes me so happy to hear all this stuff you're involved in. And also, if this takes off and goes well, how do we spread it? How do we make it not just in Massachusetts? How do we give it to every state and every mom who deserves this kind of care? Because mother-baby units don't even exist here. They do it in other countries, but we don't have that kind of support here. There may be a few, but it's a handful sprinkled across the country. So I'm very excited to kind of follow your journey and see what happens. So thank you for sharing that with us, Kriti.
Yeah, and what I will say just on that one thought is that I kind of am riding the coattails of amazing people doing work across the country, be it in a intensive outpatient setting, partial setting, or a perinatal inpatient setting. And so there's a bunch of folks that have been guiding me in the last year. I won't name all of them on this call, but there are a lot of folks doing great work here. And so it's really about how do I build upon that within my state and hopefully beyond. But there are folks that are pioneers that are doing amazing work despite the constraints in our healthcare system and the hard work, especially important now.
I do love that even though you are riding the coattails of these other folks, you bring into it your lived experience. Had you not experienced what you went through, and again, we never want to say the ends justify the means or whatever, but you bringing that personal experience, just like you said, the survivor stories and how much you can take what was a really scary, traumatic time in your life and let it fuel a solution, let it fuel prevention for future moms that may be going through something like this. And so I think that is really valuable. And you even being here today with the storytelling, let that continue to fuel and inspire maybe some listeners to say, wait, I want to hear more about that. I'm in Massachusetts. I want to get involved. How do I do that? And so I'm hoping we do have listeners all across the world. And I hope that maybe your story and the work you're doing is lighting a fire and fueling and inspiring others as well.
Thank you.
On that note, we have always like to end with hearing about how our guests are healing their inner tigress. And as both now a guest and listener, you know what question comes next. If you could go back in time to the time that you were going through maybe the toughest, wherever that may be, what's something you would go back and tell yourself?
I think just the importance of self-love. I would tell myself that what I would tell my friend, that you're resilient, that this experience may not shape you into who you thought you'd be, but exactly who you're meant to be. And that, like any form of trauma or grief or loss, with that are hidden gifts, and allow them to reveal themselves. And so I think for me, it's really, there's no experience that will make you love yourself more than becoming a mom. And your daughter will see the light when you don't see it. She'll see it and she'll believe it and she'll feel it. And I think I needed to hear that. And I think I would have said that if I were supporting someone else, but I wish it hadn't taken me so long to be able to feel that and say that to myself.
That is absolutely beautiful. I'm like tearing up right now. Oh, Kriti, we could talk to you forever. Where can our listeners find more of you if they want to? I've listened to the podcast that you've worked on as well. So where else can they find more of you?
Yeah, that's a great point. Well, if you're in Massachusetts or you're at PSI conferences, don't be a stranger. I'm the loud middle-aged Indian woman with green glasses, so they hear me before you can see me. So that's the first thing. But sorry, I had to lighten the mood. I'm like, heavy stuff. But the other thing I would say is, in the spirit of mental health, I have been paring down my social media use in terms of Instagram, but I am very active on LinkedIn. And I would love to connect on LinkedIn. And so I'm happy to share my profile. And I can't tell you the number of kind folks that have taken the time to chat with me and connected me to others. So I'm, more than happy to connect with anyone that way. And, know that, regardless of whether or not you can reach me, the PSI team, whether we're on the board, whether we're volunteers, or even the Mass General team, is always here to support you on your journey wherever you're at. And I'm so grateful to this team for having me on.
Thank you for your time today, Kriti. We'll definitely link those things. So glad you asked podcast and maybe the Postpartum Support Psychosis Survivors group. So thanks again for your time.
Thank you.
We want to thank you deeply for tuning into this episode of Healing the Tigress. The more we share these stories, the more we can help our AAPI mothers and partners. If you enjoyed this episode and our mission, you can help us out in the following ways. Follow our show wherever you get your podcasts. Leave us a rating and/or a review, and share our podcast with a friend.
We also encourage you to follow us on Instagram at Healing the Tigress, where we hope to build a community of healing tigresses and give you updates on what's coming. And if you want more bonus episodes, please check out our show notes for how to subscribe to our exclusive content. Or you can also head over to our Buzzsprout page at healingthetigress.buzzsprout.com. We are not for profit. We are here to help our community, but any support you give us is so deeply appreciated. Above all, thank you from the bottom of our hearts for being here.
Healing the Tigress is produced and edited by Peggy and Jasmine.
Music for this show is remixed by Dr. Tony Huynh of Tony Mixes.
Our intro music is a cover of You and Me by Z Avi, played by our co-host Peggy.
Our outro music is a cover of Green Island Serenade, played by Jasmine's sister.
Cover art design is by Dr. Angela Chung.